This is Maggie Lee, and no, if you were at the cemetery on Saturday night for the tour, she was not around when Joel Heatwall ran the paper.
Somebody asked me that.
Did they really?
Yes.
Well, Maggie's been around the paper for a long time, but Joel died in 1910, and honest to goodness, Maggie wasn't even born yet.
No.
So when did you come into the world?
1921. And my parents had been married 14 years and thought they were not ever going to be blessed with a child, and lo and behold, I came. So I'm the only one.
And boy, were they surprised.
Yeah.
Now, you were born in the old hospital. Where was it then?
At 8th and Water. It's an apartment building now. It had been a house to start with and then was made over into a hospital. It lacked some conveniences, I guess. I don't know what kind of night crew they had because the furnace went out. I was born in January, and the furnace went out one night, and nobody knew until the cook came in at 5 a.m. And she realized it was cold. She built a fire in her kitchen range, and then she went right away to the nursery to see how we were doing, and we were turning blue. So she took us out and put us in the warming oven of the kitchen range.
You know, actually, if that hadn't happened to an aunt of mine, I wouldn't believe that. But when she was born, she was half of a set of twins. And together the twins weighed 4 pounds. And they were born in January, much before you were born. And because there was no incubator, they were put into shoe boxes that were filled with wool and popped into the warming oven. Good thing there was a warming oven.
Boy, yes. I started having hay fever when I was very young, and I've always wondered if that experience had anything to do with my becoming allergic to things.
Depends on what else was in the warming oven besides the babies. Now, you were an only child.
Yep.
Which meant that you lived in an adult world all the time.
That's true. And our neighborhood, right close, there were no children. They were all old couples. And a block or so away, there were 2 big families. I think there were 12 in one and 7 or 8 in the other. And they were not the best brought up kids. And my mother...
Oh, tisk.
My mother didn't want me to be playing with them. But sometimes I did anyway. And then a block away was a nice family of 3 boys. But really, I did a lot of pretending. I pretended there were people living in the trees, and sort of thing. And next door was an old couple that their only grandchildren were up in Canada, and I guess they enjoyed having me as much as I enjoyed having them.
Oh, nice.
And they had a little hill in their lawn down to the backyard, and I was allowed to go up and down that hill with my sled. So I spent a lot of time over there.
Now, did they tell you stories, or did you tell them stories?
Probably more I told them some, but their granddaughter, one of their granddaughters, eventually moved here and lived here, and I said something to her about how I appreciated having them when I didn't. My own grandparents were in New York State. Well, the one grandfather was dead, but she said they appreciated having you as much as you appreciated having them.
Since you grew up in this wonderful world where you were the druid who worshipped the trees and had all the characters in the trees, what happened when you went to school for the first time?
Well, that was funny. The grade school was only 2 blocks from our house, and we didn't have kindergarten in those days. That was the Great Depression, and kindergarten was one of the things that could be supported financially. And anyway, my mother took me down there for first grade, and I was just astounded with all the kids that were out there on the playground before the bell rang so we could go in the building. I somehow didn't know there were that many kids in the world.
What do you remember best about school when you were in grade school?
Well, the first grade teacher had pets, and not four-legged ones.
No gerbils.
No rats either. And when she announced that there were too many kids in our class and that the penmanship teacher was going to take an overflow group, I thought, well, I'll be in that. And sure enough, I was. But that was okay. The second grade teacher was wonderful, and third grade was not so great. Fourth one, I was just a fine person. Fifth grade was even finer. So and George Washington had its 200th birthday, I guess, during my fifth grade. And I think that's what we were celebrating anyway. I loved art in those days, and we made a whole long counter of everything from his birthplace to Mount Vernon. We made those out of paper and cardboard.
So you had a timeline diorama?
Yeah.
Oh.
And I made the cherry tree that he chopped down.
Did your dad help you?
No, it was just a little thing. It was some bush that I found out in our yard, and then I put pink construction paper flowers on it.
Oh, it was in bloom.
Yes.
The reason I asked about your dad helping you is he was a carpenter, and making a tree seemed to be something that was part of his occupation.
Well, he had great ideas about what was women's work and what was men's work. But I will say this, that every Saturday, he did not work on Saturday, and he had a lot of errands to do, and he took me along on those. And I still have so many memories. He was trying to buy a car during part of that, and we would go to a garage and sit on the floor and visit about the cars. And we ended up with a used, well, I lived through, he already had when I was, it was after I was born, he had one second hand. That was what they called a touring car. It had side curtains, there were no windows.
Isinglass curtains
Yeah.
you could pull right down.
And then he got a Maxwell.
Woo!
And that had belonged to a woman in Minneapolis, and it had a built-in hat box in the back seat, an upholstered hat box. And
Oh, how elegant.
me in the hat box sat in the back.
Did it also have vases?
Yes, that one had crystal vases on it was just two doors in that, that's right, the front seats folded up so you could get in. And anyway, there were these vases, and Mother bought red crepe paper roses to put in those. So when he was bargaining, he didn't buy a new car. Well, it was a dealer's car. It had been around a few months, but hadn't belonged to anybody before we had it. That was a Chrysler, 1927 Chrysler. And it was green, and the Minnesota license plate that year was green with black figures, and it matched the car. I thought that was really something. And not long ago, I saw a 1927 Minnesota license plate in an antique shop, and I almost bought it.
I bet you did. And you would have if it had had a cat on it, right?
Oh, yes. Well, anyway, that touring car I especially remember because we often went to Minneapolis, and his mother had a sister there and Dad had a sister there. And we were coming home one night when a really bad storm came up. And here we are without windows, you know. And so we had to get out and put these isinglass things on somewhere along the river bottoms.
Oh my gosh.
Glendale Highway.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a brand new felt hat that he really liked. And he should have left it in the car, of course, but he didn't think, and it blew off, and he never saw it again.
Oh, how hard. You know, Saturday night at the cemetery, Dan Freeman had the bowler hat that was Les Freeman's.
Mm-hmm.
And the original price tag for that was $8.50.
Mm-hmm.
A goodly sum back then.
Yes.
And you went to high school here in Northfield, and the high school was where?
The building that Carlton has just obtained.
The old...
It's between 3rd and 4th on Union.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you were editor of the Periscope, and thus your fame.
Yeah. Oh, I loved that. I was news editor. The editor didn't do a lot of footwork, I must say, but he did help make it up when we used to print downtown. This is in the hot metal days, linotypes and hot metal presses. And we made up, one year, there were 2 newspapers, 2 weekly newspapers in those days, came out on the same day, across the street from each other. And one year we were in one shop, and the next year in the other one. And I really liked the printers and the linotype operators and the people that I met in those places.
Now back then, the Northfield News was on Division Street.
Mm-hmm.
And was at the corner by the library.
Well, it was it's where the dance school is now, and the jewelry store.
Oh, okay. And it was across from where what was then the fire station.
More or less, yeah.
Now, where was the Independent?
Well, that was later became the end of Herman's building.
Oh, okay.
What's there now? Is it that?
The end of the Purvis building.
What is the name of that store? It moved from Diggs, I guess.
Oh, right. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that was also where the first radio station, where Kim started, up in the attic, wasn't it? And the old Perman building.
Maybe so. Huh.
I think so. And in the basement there was a bowling alley at one time. Because I remember when we had the bookstore going down there. And there's a bowling. There are bowling lanes, or there were then.
Maybe so.
There's a lot to Northfield that you have to go upstairs or downstairs to find out.
Right.
Now, after high school, I know. Tell us about the man in the print room, Bob Boone,
Mm-hmm.
who was married to the beautiful woman who walked on the roofs.
Yeah. Bob was, I can't remember if he was totally black or half black. He was the only black person in Northfield for a long time. And she always thought that people mistreated them or snubbed them because he was black and she was white. But the truth of it was she was such an odd character that nobody liked her. A lot of people liked Bob. And she was very jealous of him. They lived in an apartment above what's now Mandarin Gardens, and she would walk across the rooftops of the buildings on that side of the street to peer into the windows of the Independent, wondering what he was doing down there, if he was with some other woman. I did forget to end up the story about the red roses in the crystal vases. When we bought the Chrysler, or when he was dickering for it, I assumed that, you know, if you need a loaf of bread, you go out and buy it and take it home. So I thought we needed a car, and we were going to buy that and take it home. And I was very disturbed that he would forget those roses. So I remember tugging at his sleeve and, don't forget the roses. And he said, oh, honey, we aren't going to take the car today.
Now, after high school, you stayed here a year because
yeah,
you
I
weren't
had
well.
not been well. I had my antrum sinuses would get infections in them. This would start with an allergy, and then I'd get this infection, and then my kidneys would get involved, and I ended up in the hospital quite often. And I just didn't feel well, and I did manage to be. I spent most of my senior year in the hospital, but I ended up valedictorian anyway. Anyway, I just wasn't able to go off to school. And I felt, and then I got antsy. I wanted to get going, get some career started or something. And so when I felt better, instead of going to college, I decided to go to a business college and learn accounting. And this was really kind of funny because arithmetic had always been my poorest subject, although I got straight A's and everything, but it was the one that I really kind of struggled with. But of course, accounting isn't very complicated as far as arithmetic is concerned, and I did all right in business college. And then I was sent out on, there were several of us sent out to be interviewed at it was a several floor clothing store, an exclusive one in Minneapolis, and I was the one that was hired, chosen to work the next week.
Oh my goodness. What wasn't Donaldson's where your mother started out as a
John
model?
W. Thomas Company.
John W. Thomas?
Mm-hmm.
Mm. But since you were in a clothing store as an accountant, your mother was in a clothing store as a model, right?
Right. That was at Donaldson's. She was learning to make hats back in 1906, I suppose that was. And hats in those days there was a fine white wire that they shaped them with, and then they lined them, and the outside of the hat dragged down on your shoulders, and there were all kinds of maybe birds or flowers or something or other all over the outside of the thing. And she was learning to assemble those. The woman that managed the very exclusive shop in Donaldson's that was fancier even than Dayton's Oval Room, came through there for something. And purple was the big color, purple and mauve were the big colors that year. And she stopped dead still in front of my mother. Mother, I take after my dad. Mother was beautiful. Anyway.
Your dad wasn't bad looking either, sweetheart.
No, he wasn't. But he wasn't, he was handsome for a man, I guess you'd say. She was gorgeous. And she stopped dead still in front of my mother and said, "You can wear purple." And she hired her on the spot, and Mother decided that was great. She took the job. She came down to town every morning. Her hair was professionally arranged, and she spent the day walking around with different hats on her head.
Doesn't sound like a bad occupation, does it?
No.
How did your mom and dad meet?
Well, that was funny. Dad was born and grew up in Alexandria, Minnesota. His parents were also from New York, but had come a slightly different year than my mother's parents, who came from New York. And they went to Alexandria. This is kind of funny. His mother grew up in a fairly wealthy family. Her dad had a large general store in Canada, and they had servants. And she didn't know how to cook when she got married. And so what did he do but move her out to Alexandria, Minnesota, which was the wilds in those days. And she learned to cook in a hurry, I guess. But anyway, they finally moved down to Minneapolis, and Dad was their youngest child, and then a slightly older daughter, I think she was a couple of years older than Dad, were still at home. And they moved right next door to the aunt with whom my mother was living while she had this job in the French room. And in those days, you did not speak to anyone unless you were properly introduced. And sometimes this sister of my dad would come out and visit with my mother in the yard between the two houses. And Dad would come trotting out there because he wanted to meet Mother. And the sister wouldn't introduce them because she knew that she was not about ever going to get married. She'd figured that out. And she wanted Dad to remain a bachelor so that the two could live together. And so she didn't want him meeting this pretty girl. And so one night, probably 6 or 7 o'clock in the summer night, Mother was swinging on her aunt's front porch swing when he came whistling out of his front door and heading down to the corner store. And she had a little brass in her. She said, "Don't be gone long." And he turned around and said, "I'll be right back." So he came back with a 5-pound box of candy. And they sat in the swing and ate candy and got acquainted. And they eventually eloped. That would have been the summer of 1907, and they eloped on December 3rd.
Where did they go when they eloped?
They went to a church. Neither of them were churchgoers, but there was this church nearby. And that was sort of funny. There was a Ladies' Aid convention going on in the church, and usually the pastor's wife would witness any kind of a wedding that turned up that way, but she was busy with this convention. So the pastor went up into the convention and asked who would be willing to come down and witness this ceremony. And the first people he asked was a couple of abbots from Northfield. And they said, nah, they were too busy, they didn't want to be bothered. And they turned out to be my parents' next door neighbors for years. Well, anyway, that's where they got married. And they didn't have a honeymoon, they just rented an apartment.
Well, going back to your accounting, was there a point where accounting became something you would like to get rid of and do something else?
Yes. It bored me. I just wasn't happy with it. I did well, got all the bonuses and whatnot, but I just didn't. And I liked the people I worked with, but it just didn't satisfy me at all. And I told my mother, she kept asking me why didn't I come back to Northfield. I said the only reason I would ever come back would be if I could get a job at the Northfield News. And I got on the train one weekend. This was during World War II when you didn't drive because of gasoline and tires, and I didn't. I didn't even take the bus to come home for a weekend because it had flat tires all the time, and you'd be stuck out in the country while they changed tires. So I started taking the train. And got aboard one night, and there was Margaret Starks, who later became a businesswoman in Northfield. but her mother worked at the Northfield News, and she beckoned to me to come and sit with her. And pretty soon she said, "Say, you ought to look into it. They need a bookkeeper at the Northfield News." And I thought, my goodness, I will look into that. And when I got home, I walked back into the kitchen and said to my mother, "I hear they need a bookkeeper at the Northfield News." And she says, "Yes, you have an appointment at 7:30. So I took that job 62 years ago.
That's amazing. Well, once you started out as a bookkeeper.
Yeah.
And when we came to town, you were the editor.
Mm-hmm.
There must have been another bookkeeper someplace along the line.
Well, very fortunately, Herman Rowe was the, well, it was a corporation, but you might say he owned the news. And his brother Norman had been in service and had a heart attack. He was an accountant. And so he came to Northfield to recuperate. And pretty soon he was down in the news and helping me took over a certain part of the bookkeeping. And after a while he took the whole thing over so I could do writing all the time. I was hired by a strange person who was trying to force the news into bankruptcy so he could buy it at sheriff's sale. Herman Rowe was down in Washington, D.C. at the time, dispensing Republican information to weekly newspapers across the nation. And he loved that job and really wanted to keep doing it. But some of his Northfield friends told him that this fellow that was managing the news was a crook and that he better get back here if he wanted a newspaper. And so he finally quit that job down there and came back and ushered this crook out of the place.
Who shall remain nameless? The crook will remain nameless, right?
Now I could tell you what his name was.
Do.
Mulcahy Graham. He said he was from Norway, and I think he probably was. He had quite an accent. And Herman had thought he'd work out well here with all the Norwegians, but he was a crook. But anyway, he didn't get along well with the staff, and Margaret's mother quit during the 2 weeks that I was giving notice of the other job, so she was not there when I got there.
Ah.
And for that reason, I had to start writing right away. And I spent half the week writing and half the week with the bookkeeping. And but as I say, I eventually got rid of the bookkeeping. After a while, I got to be, what did they call me? News editor, I guess, and then I got to be managing editor, and then finally editor.
What were some of the most exciting, interesting stories that you covered?
Oh, goodness. I remember one of the most horrible was a little kid that had fallen into the stock tank at his parents' farm. Oh. And I can still see being out there. Of course, they pulled him out by that time, but we were kind of gathered around the stock tank. Mm. Well, of course, the first defeat of Jesse, it was just Jesse James Day the first time. That was exciting.
What, 47?
48.
48.
Mm-hmm. And they gave away a car in connection with that.
No, that tradition should have continued.
And no, that was, I can still see they did the reenactment on the corner because the building still looked as it had on the corner. They've since replaced a lot of the stonework.
Well, especially the ones that had the bullet holes in them.
Yeah. Well, that was funny. Our first manager of the Historical Society was Ginny Mondale, whose husband was a brother or half-brother of Armand. And she assumed there were these holes in the building, and somebody put black circles around them, and she took people out there to show them these bullet holes, that those were from the actual raid. And when she finally found out that somebody had bored them, she really felt awful.
We still have those holes today.
Oh, hey, the legend lives on.
Yeah.
Someone's drew a circle around some hole.
And I saw the car that ran into the building that wrecked the fronts of the stores that were there, and that's why we have stonework on the first floor out here. At the time, I felt awful about it, and I hadn't realized we'd get enough insurance to